and I'll be sharing my screen. So let me know in the chat or using your microphones if you can see my screen and if my voice is clear enough.
Everything is visible and audible.
Thank you. All right. All right, so now we can get started, I think. As usual, we're two people, basically Eldor and I will be discussing the chart and trying to write a report at the same time, educating and analyzing and making it an educational and instructional video. Okay, so without further ado, let's get started with this particular task one, and I want to also copy the prompt as well. So, that would help with our introduction. Okay, oops. All right, so the charts below give information about average weekly rent for houses and apartments in Australia, in 4 Australian cities in 2016 and 2017. So, as we all usually do, we have, we'll ask Toshmat to write his introduction first. So he's going to write his own version by just paraphrasing every single word. For those who don't know who Toshmat is the average Uzbek IELTS test taker, and he learned, from his teachers that to write a good introduction, he needs to paraphrase every single word. So instead of the charts, he can write something like the bar charts. So the bar charts. Or even instead of charts, you can write something like graphs, bar graphs. Below, usually he says something like the given bar graphs give information about. Give information about maybe something like
illustrates data.
Yeah, maybe provide data, maybe. Instead of about, you can say something like on average weekly rent. Okay, now maybe instead of average, usually what do you think Toshmat might say instead of average? I've heard like maybe
median, average instead of
median. Yeah, that's what Toshmat would probably say, median or mean. So median weekly rent instead of rent. Now, like for weekly, we can say per week, but rent, what do you think? Which one?
Higher.
Okay. Median higher per week. So median higher for maybe something like instead of houses, you can say for homes and flats instead of apartments per week. And instead of 4, maybe you can just name the cities. Say in Sydney, Hobart, Darwin, and Perth. Sydney, Hobart, Darwin, and Perth. Darwin and Perth. And the years. You might say like from 2016 to 2017. So the given bar graphs provide data on median hire for homes. As you can see, the whole idea here is that when Toshmat paraphrases every single word, the meaning somehow gets lost. So he's trying to show off that he can find a synonym for every single word, like even the word average. But the words average and median or hire and rent are not really interchangeable in this context. So, the key takeaway here is you don't have to paraphrase every single word, okay? So now we're going to ask Eldon to try out his introduction. If you're here, Eldon, let's hear your version.
Yeah, I'm here. I'm thinking. I'm thinking like there aren't many things that we can actually paraphrase here.
Yeah.
The like average weekly rent, houses, apartments, Australian cities. Like there isn't a good way of paraphrasing them. So
maybe like something. Because it's also a trend chart, but it's also comparing like four cities, right?
Yeah.
So my version, so you can think about your own version as well. Like my version would be something like the bar charts compare 4 Australian cities in terms of weekly rent. So compare 4 Australian cities in terms of weekly rent for houses and apartments. Maybe rent for houses and apartments in the years 2016 and 2017. Something like that, I think, to keep it very simple. So if you want to get back and, tell us your version, or maybe like want to think again.
I was actually thinking exactly the same.
Okay. All right. So So what I'm gonna do is I'm just gonna, move this over and then try to write another introduction. Something like the bar charts. Like show, maybe, like how the.
What about?
Yeah, I'll get back to you regarding Illustrate. The bar charts show, like whenever you have give information about, it's a great chance for you to use the word show, because that's like the first choice of this for an IELTS. Even for IELTS test makers, they use either show or give information about. Show is their first number one choice. Give information about is their number 2 choice. So if they give you like give information about, they're basically letting you use show, right? Which is their most favorite word. So the bar charts show how the average weekly rent may be like changed, right? Like maybe for houses and apartments, changed between 2016 and 2017 in 4 different cities in Australia. So like, if we have cities in Australia in the prompt, then I would change it. Yeah, Australian cities, you can use cities in Australia. So how weekly rent, how the average weekly rent for houses and apartments, has to be apartments, changed between 2016 and 2017 in 4 different cities in Australia. As you can see, if you can do this, even if your own practice, like writing 3 different versions of the introduction, you can notice that like you actually get better as you go, as you progress. Like I always, use Toshmat as a stepping stone, because it kind of, it's there's less pressure for me to come up with introduction as bad as Toshmat would write. So that kind of gives me this freedom to maybe think and analyze the mistakes that he made, And then I usually give the mic to Eldar because, first of all, he's really good at writing, so he can produce an introduction. Then I would use his introduction as another stepping stone, and then I would produce mine. But this time, Eldar was like, he really avoided somehow writing it into the introduction, so I had to produce two. But as you can see, still, the last introduction, the final version was, I think, slightly better in terms of paraphrasing, in terms of like not repeating. So like we kind of changed, like show how something changed, because this is a chain chart, so it's a good structure. Like how, so I'm going to highlight these two things like words, how something changed, right? So you can use the same structure, like saying the graph, so whatever graph, right? So you might have bar graph, doesn't matter, shows how X changed. But if you have like 2 years in the past, then so if you have 1 year in the past and 1 year in present, then you have to use how something has changed. Present perfect. Like between this, like and that, right? 2 separate years. So you can use the structure for the introduction when you're describing like chain charts. Any questions at this point with the introduction? I think it's kind of clear, and it shouldn't take more than 2 minutes, I think. Like, first of all, yeah, we start with the introduction, but we shouldn't have started with introduction, to be honest. But you could do that, I think, because with the to look at the intro, like to be able to write a good introduction, I don't think you need a thorough planning. But if you want to start with introduction, then you need to kind of step back and try to analyze the graph afterwards, like plan your response afterwards. But it would be better if, I think, we start with the planning and then write the introduction. But I kind of got caught in the moment, and I start writing the introduction right away. But in the exam, try to plan before you start writing. So that's planning, as we talked before, includes or involves analyzing the chart. So we're analyzing, this is for houses. Like I said, this is apples and oranges. So you don't want to really compare across the charts. There's no need to make the connection between these houses and apartments. These are two different things. So clearly, I would go for, like, as for grouping, I would talk about the houses in the first body paragraph and the apartments in the second. What do you think, Eldar? Like, would you agree, or do you think you can maybe somehow talk about them?
Yes. Generally, you're right. When you have two graphs, it's always better and easier to talk about them separately. But this specific one, like, it has so many. We have so many options here. You can go, like, I can count at least 3 ways of grouping this. So, because, like, I'm thinking, like, we can talk about Sydney and Darwin separately, or maybe we can even talk about Hobart and Darwin. Like, this gives us so many options, and this is a kind of a nice change of pace from the previous one, because it was so difficult.
Yeah, it was the previous chart we looked at, which was this one, was really challenging, to be honest. I think we still did a good job with the model answer, which I'm going to share later. I also shared the video already. But this one is slightly easier and much better to write about. But I think to keep everything simple, it's better to just discuss the houses, the change in the rent for houses in one paragraph, and then talk about the change in the weekly rent for apartments separately, because these two things cannot really be put together. I see what you're saying about like grouping by cities, like Sydney and maybe Darwin because it's slightly higher. So talk about Sydney and Darwin, where both, for houses and apartments, the weekly rent is higher, and then it kind of went up from this year to that year. But yeah, I think it would make more sense to kind of group them separately. Okay, so let me just check the chat box to see like what everyone is saying. I think like everyone is just posting their introduction. Another like Toshmat style introduction I would expect, but we never know. Okay, Shehzad used that like how much money tenants spend normally on houses and apartments. This is really unclear because, yeah, I don't know. All right. Okay, so that's it, right? That's in rent in dollars, Australian dollars. You can add that too, I think, right? So the units are measured in Australian dollars if you want to. This is very. I'm going to add that to your version, like Ildar. The units are measured.
I am usually against that idea of talking about measure, but here it would be nice because like when you are writing dollars and dollars and dollars, the reader might get confused. Yeah.
Right. So they might be misled about the US dollar. So yeah, that's why I put it there. Like I'm 50-50 on that. Like sometimes I like it. I usually think it's not really necessary, but in this case, it might be because we're talking about Australian dollars. Yeah. Okay. All right. Okay, so we can safely move on to the overview part now. Since we're clear on grouping, what do you think would be worth saying in the overview? So some of the highlights of the chart. As we can see, the average rent in Sydney and Darwin. So it's good to point out that the average weekly rent for the cities Sydney and Darwin, for both houses and apartments, are higher than the other two cities, right? That's one thing to point out. Maybe you can also talk about the overall change, that the weekly rent actually went up for houses in all cities, and for apartments in all cities except Perth. So that's going to be slightly tricky to include that exception, with the exception of Perth, right? So you can say house rent for houses, like housing. How do you paraphrase this? So we have to also think about like the average rent for houses in all cities went, while the average rent of houses in all cities went up. For apartments, it was the same. The same can be said about the apartments, except for the city of Perth. I don't know. So we'd have to say something like that. So we would talk about the overall increase and how everything increased except for Perth in terms of apartments. Like I said, highest and lowest. Sydney and Darwin being highest in both charts. What else? What else would you say, Alon?
I'm looking at the difference between rents of houses and apartments.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's a good point. That's a good point. So for Sydney, it's the same.
Yeah.
For Hubbard, it's lower for apartments, right? Yeah. So Darwin, it is somewhat a bit lower, yeah. For Perth, it's about the same. It's about the same.
Yeah.
Okay. That's a good point. There's something that I missed. Compare the weekly average rent for houses and apartments, right? Compare them like across. I think that's a good point to include. Like usually, rent for houses is slightly higher, right? In all cities.
Yeah.
Again, maybe with the exception of Perth. But when you make such comparisons, you have to pick the year. Like maybe you want to pick the final year, like the final standings, like 2017, right? So you can say like in 2017, the average rent for houses was slightly higher.
Yeah, but the thing is, in Sydney, in both years, they were the same. So
yeah, except Perth. Perth was an exception.
Yeah, could we say like in those years or in all cities, they were the rent for houses was like either higher or equal or something like that,
or you can say like rent for apartments. Yeah, okay.
Or
so
something like was at least equal, maybe, I don't know.
Something to express that, yeah. So that would be a good point to include in the overview. I agree. So now, do we really have to talk about all 3 points? Do we have to include all 3 in our overview? Because I mentioned something like first Sydney and Darwin being higher than the other 2 cities. And then I talked about the overall change, like that from 2016 to 2017, there was a rise also. And then you just compared the average weekly rent for houses and apartments and saying the average, that was for houses, it was higher or at least equal. Or you can say not less, right? And not lower than for the apartment. So you can say that, like, it wasn't lower. So, so we have 3 points to include. Usually, you can discuss 2 main things in the overview. So, which do you think we should, leave out, so to speak? First of all, let me just put this in writing so everyone is clear about what we're talking about. For the overview, so we're discussing key feature number 1 would be overall change, meaning the average weekly rent for houses went up in all cities, whereas the figure for apartments rose. Now, can I actually use the whereas? Because the figure for apartments also, so you can say maybe the same can be said about apartments, with the exception of Perth, where the weekly rent didn't change, something like that. So we'll definitely change the writing style. Right now I'm just writing out the first key feature, just putting it in writing. Key feature number 2 would be something about in terms of weekly rent for both houses and apartments. Sydney and Darwin like had the highest figures or something, had higher. So we would like, again, I will change the writing later, higher than the other two cities, something like that. And Ildar's version was, okay, key feature number 3, the average weekly rent for houses in all cities was higher, or at least the same as the figure for apartments, something like that. So again, we're going to change the words maybe somewhere in all these three sentences. It's just for the, usually in the exam, I just do that in my head. Like you can even do it in your own language if you need to. You just have to plan it out. And then for the overview, you just have to pick 2 maybe at least. Sometimes 3 is okay, but I think in our case, we can always leave out 1. Like, so just right now, we're at this stage of like deciding which one to leave out.
I think key feature 3 would be good if you were like grouping across graphs. But here we are talking about them separately, so maybe just key feature 1 and 2.
Okay. Yeah. Makes sense. If we were to kind of make comparisons across the charts and maybe group them like by cities, not houses and apartments, but by cities, then the third key feature would definitely be an important one. But since we're only like talking about houses and apartments separately, and key feature number 1 and 2 are more important here. Now, so what about the order now? The order is also important. Like, I usually go with from most general to less general. So in our case, the key feature number 1 is more general because it's about overall change. Well, there is an exception but still. And key feature number 2 is more specific, talking about like 2 cities, like Sydney and Darwin, having higher figures or having higher rent. You can even say having higher rent, weekly rent, than the other 2 cities. So I would put them in exactly the same order, the key feature number 1 and the key feature number 2. Right? So we can hopefully now just write our overview paragraph. So overall, now we need to really think about the English, right? The choice of words and instructions. Overall, something like the average weekly rent. The same trend can be observed in terms of apartments, or for apartment for rent, for apartments, let's say. And while the same trend can be observed for apartments, the weekly rent in Perth. Maybe you don't want to be that specific. Maybe it's better to just leave it like that. Like, overall, there was like generally, right? So you can use like the word generally, like overall overall, the average weekly rent for houses and apartments rose in all cities, like generally all cities. What would you say? Like,
when you say generally, you don't even have to say houses or apartments. You can just say rent. You know.
Yeah, I still want to say houses and apartments because it's about like. Okay, let's see. The average weekly rent. So let me just. And where would you put like generally here? Because we already have overall. The average weekly rent for houses and apartments. So maybe I want to say something like. There was an increase.
Okay, what if we don't say increase, but say average weekly rent was generally higher in 2017?
The average weekly rent, okay, that's good, was generally higher in 2017 for both houses and apartments, right?
Yeah.
Like in all cities, somewhere the average weekly rent in all cities, maybe, right? Was generally higher in 2017 for both houses and apartments. So the average weekly rent in all cities was generally higher in 2017 for both houses and apartments. Maybe something like with Sydney and Darwin being particularly high, I don't know, like being particularly more expensive to live. More expensive to live is not really like with higher rents. How would you like? I'm trying to be like with Sydney and Darwin.
What if you say having higher rent?
Having higher, what, like rent?
Yeah, but the problem is we used rent and higher already. So.
Already. Okay. So the average weekly rent in all cities was generally higher in 2017 for both houses and apartments, with Sydney and Darwin. So we can actually write a separate sentence for Sydney and Darwin, to be honest. Let me just look at the. So Sydney and Darwin being. Usually, like they would say, like higher living expenses, or how can you even how can you say, because living expenses can actually mean something else too, like not just.
Yeah, I was also thinking like we could. I was also thinking like maybe we could say Sydney and Darwin being more expensive to live in, but that's more than rent, right? So.
The average weekly rent in all cities was generally higher in 2017 for both houses and apartments. Range from apartments in cities generally higher. So, okay, so maybe something like. Okay, something like in terms of specific cities, like the rent was like same thing, higher rent. So I just want to change it to like it was more expensive to, maybe it was more expensive to rent. To rent. Accommodation, maybe, right? In Sydney and Darwin, compared to the other two cities. Compared to the other two. I don't know, something like that. So it was more expensive to rent accommodation in Sydney and Darwin compared to the other two.
Okay. What if we say Sydney and Darwin were more expensive to rent accommodation in?
I don't think Grammarly would like that structure. I can write it down, but it's like it just it sounded complex to me. Like Sydney and Darwin were more expensive to rent accommodation in, and like usually in academic English, like let me just put this in, like so Sydney. So this is this alternative version. Sydney and Darwin were more expensive in terms of. Did you say in terms of?
No, to rent accommodation in.
To rent accommodation in. Yeah, usually it's not a good idea to end your sentence with a preposition. So yeah, like it just sounded awkward to me. The Sydney and Darwin were more expensive to rent accommodation in. Like, yeah, I don't know. I wouldn't phrase it that way for some reason. In Sydney and Darwin compared to the other two. All right, so I'm just gonna leave it out for now. I think I'm okay, like with the overview we have, right? We have about 39 words, which is okay, and what was the introduction? If we were to use this introduction, let's say like 24 versus 39, so it's about 60 something words. All right. So we can move on. We can safely move on now to the, the body paragraphs. Since we've separated by houses and apartments, so you can always like say, in terms of houses, right? Something like, or do you have a better version? I don't know, better alternative. In terms of weekly rent for houses, I don't know. Or maybe in terms of houses, or in terms of renting houses. Something like that, right? We need because we need something to say about like this paragraph is about houses, so that's like we need a topic sentence or at least a and some sort of entry. So in terms of renting houses, Let me see now. Right now, I'm having some doubts about my grouping. Average weekly rent for houses. So like it went up from like in Sydney, went up in Hobart, Darwin, and Perth. Because like even this chart on its own can be a writing task. Like, and if we were to talk about this chart, then we would probably have I would group like Sydney and Perth together because there's in terms of this because of the difference gap because there's a bigger gap in Hobart and Darwin. So I would say something like Sydney and Perth. So I would say something like in terms of houses, the average weekly rent is the highest and lowest in Sydney and Perth, respectively.
Okay, what if we put this information in non-identifying relative clause? I know I'm saying non-identifying relative clause.
Okay.
A lot now, but so we can say in Sydney and Perth, where average weekly rent was the highest and lowest respectively, and then we can talk about the increase.
Okay. So you want to start with in Sydney and Perth, right?
Yeah.
But in Sydney,
see how it looks.
Okay, where the average weekly rent was? Can we say now was or is or was?
Was.
In Sydney and Perth, where the average weekly rent was the highest and lowest. Now we want to say like experienced. So I would say something like maybe
not in Sydney and Perth. Sydney and Perth, where
okay, Sydney and Perth. Okay, experienced then, right? Like where the average weekly rent was the highest and lowest. And then we can say something like experienced a slight, right? Like or marginal rise.
Okay.
Rise. So like something like now. You can end the sentence here and then talk about the figures, right?
Yeah. With maybe while in 2016 it was this and this, and then in 2000
something like that. Yeah. So we're gonna keep this sentence then. Like so, Sydney and Perth were the average. I need the houses. So in terms of in terms of houses then, right? In terms of houses, Sydney and Perth were the average. Where the average weekly rent was the highest and lowest, respectively, experienced the marginal rise. And then you would say something like, okay, while the figure for Sydney $500. It's about 500 Australian dollars. 500 Australian dollars. About 500 and what? Just about 500 Australian dollars. Oops. Yeah, okay, this one. Still the same. Maybe something like hovered around. Around like 500 Australian dollars, right? Maybe something like this. Oops. While the figure for Sydney hovered around 500 Australian dollars, the average weekly rent, or you can say the weekly rent for a house in Perth cost about what? About $300, right?
Yeah.
It was less than 300, and then they kind of increased. Okay, still. Okay, so that, but we didn't really talk about rise. We mentioned there was a marginal rise, so maybe not really talk about that difference much. While the figure for Sydney hovered around 500 Australian USD, the weekly rent for a house in Perth cost about 300 Australian USD.
So, or we can just say, while this figure for Sydney rose from this to this, and then in Perth, yeah, something like that. I don't know.
But is it really worth mentioning? Like, I'm not sure about this $505 to $510. Like, I'm not really sure about this, talking about this rise. So we already said there was a marginal rise. I think it's okay to just, mention leave it there and mention just 500. It's 500 and 300. There's a difference, which is this is the highest and lowest, right? But the gap was and then you can say, but the rise was more noticeable, right?
Yeah.
So something like the rise. Well, maybe we'll start with like, by contrast, the rise for weekly rent again, the rise in weekly rent. Maybe just the rise was more noticeable for which Hobart and Darwin. The figure for Hobart in 2016, for example, or you can say the average weekly, the average rent, the average weekly rent for a house in Hobart in 2016 was about what is it? $300. Again, $300, right? Australian USD. But it had risen to almost $400. By the next year, by the following year, something like that. The figure for Darwin also saw an increase from maybe something price here.
Yeah, we could have said here both increased by $100. So
okay, really? About $100?
Yeah. If you look at it, it's about $100 in both of them. So you could somehow talk about 2016 together for both cities.
But what about like I wanted to like, because there's a difference. But this is increasing from 300 to 400. The other one is like 400 something to 500 something, right?
Yeah. So in 2000, the rent for like the cost of rent for two cities were 300 and 420, both of which increased by $100. Both of which had increased by $100.
Okay, so let me just now then the average weekly rent for a house in Hobart, and you want to say Hobart and Darwin, right?
For the two cities.
For the other two cities, but we need to mention the name though.
You mentioned in the previous sentence.
Did I? Oh, okay. Sorry, but I forgot. So the average weekly rent for a house in the two cities.
Or in these two cities.
Okay. Okay, in these two cities. In 2016, right? So was about, or now I want to say maybe cost, about 300 and 420 Australian USD, maybe respectively again.
Respectively. Both of which had increased.
Both of which had risen, right? Maybe by about almost maybe, right? Hundreds USD by the following year. Is that what we want to say?
Yeah, I think about is better because almost would imply that it is lower.
Yeah, but I just we already used like about here, so I was kind of using
roughly.
Roughly, okay, roughly 100 Australian dollars by the following year. Now let me just read it. I'm not really happy with this paragraph, but let's just read it and see. In terms of houses, Sydney and Perth, where the average weekly rent was the highest and lowest respectively, experienced a marginal rise. While the figure for Sydney hovered around 500 Australian USD, the weekly rent for a house in Perth cost about 300 Australian USD. Maybe you can say cost like 200 USD less. I don't know. By contrast, the rise was more noticeable for Hobart and Darwin. The average weekly rent for house, we don't have to say house, I think, right?
Yeah.
The average weekly rent in these two cities in 2016, maybe then we can say just was about 300, or maybe stood at about 300 and 400 respectively, both of which had risen by roughly 100 Australian dollars by the following year. I think I'm okay. I don't know. What do you think, Hildur? My excitement for this graph, somehow disappeared or waned because I thought it was easy, but this, making comparisons and talking about the change at the same time is still complex.
Yeah. I think, it would be more exciting if you wrote, if you described across graphs.
Okay. That makes sense.
This is a good paragraph. I actually like this. I think what you're worried about is it looks a little bit mechanical. Maybe.
Yeah. That's what I'm worried about.
Yes, but the description itself is really good, I think.
Okay. If we have time left, maybe we can try at least one paragraph where we can maybe, we can do that, hopefully. One paragraph just covering, comparing houses and apartments, talking about maybe Sydney and Perth or the other two. All right, so in terms of houses, what about the apartments now, right? So you can say, moving on to apartments.
Yeah.
All right, now what to say about apartments? We have all, kind of having the same degree of change, except Perth, right? So we can say that, we can say the change for all three cities, or for all cities except Perth, or maybe like change for Sydney, Hobart, and Darwin was about the same, right? There was a what else can you say? Like there was almost no change, maybe, right? There was almost like was a little change.
Yeah.
This time. Can say there was only a maybe like let me just write it out and see. There was only a slight change in weekly rent. And for Sydney, Hobart, and Darwin. So maybe while there was only a slight change in weekly rent for Sydney, Hobart, and Darwin, the figure for Perth, so no change at all, maybe, across the years, maybe. Change at all. Maybe between the years. Now, I'm really having trouble specifying the figures because, like I said, it's about 500 again. There was a slight change, and then Hobart was about like 250. There was a slight change. Darwin 400, slight change. So I feel like we should have gone the other way. We should have talked about like houses and apartments instead of. There was not much really change, but comparing a rent for houses and apartments, I think would make more sense to me now for some reason. But we have to finish this paragraph anyway. This might happen, to anyone in the exam. You're like halfway through your report. You're halfway through your usually a report, and then somehow you just notice that you really messed up the grouping, and there was a better way of grouping, or there is a better way of grouping. Even though you notice that, even though you realize that the other way is better, you still have to finish because you can't really undo, all your writing and start over. Then you would lose your precious time, valuable time. So it's better to just stick to what you have decided and finish what you have started, right? So moving on to apartments, while there was only a slight change in weekly rent for Sydney, Hobart, and Darwin, the figure for Perth saw no change at all between the 2 years. Okay, so maybe I wanted to start with something like the average, and then I will change it. The average. Again, weekly rent for Sydney, Hobart, and maybe I want to put Darwin and Hubbard stood at, like it doesn't really matter, stood at about 500 Australian dollars. Darwin, it was about 400 Australian dollars and 250 Australian dollars respectively. And then we can say in the year 2017, like because we need so the average rent for Sydney, respectively. In 2016. Oh, we'll maybe want to start with in 2016. Like in 2016, the average weekly rent for Sydney, Darwin, and Hubbard maybe for an apartment in Sydney, Darwin, Hubbard stood at around respectively. And then I would say something like the following year saw only a slight change in the figures. Something like maybe while the following year saw only slight change in the figures for these cities, Perth was the only city where the weekly rent saw no change at all, or something like that. Now, in that case, we can forget the first sentence and then start with right away. In 2016, the average weekly rent for an apartment in Sydney, or maybe we can say something like renting an average apartment, maybe in Sydney, Darwin, Hubbard costs about 500, 400, and 250 respectively. While the following year saw only a slight change, right? Maybe not change, but slight rise, right? Slight increase in the figures. Maybe something like that in the figures. Perth was the only city where the weekly rent saw no change at all. Or maybe you can say there was no change in the figure for Perth or something. So what do you think about this? Now I think I restructured the sentence. It's shorter, but somehow there is nothing unnecessary, I think.
Yeah. If I could give a few suggestions, we could say instead of renting an average apartment, we could say renting an apartment in cities costs on average about.
Good. Yeah, I didn't really like the word average apartment though. Renting an apartment in Sydney, Darwin, and costs about, what would you say? On average, right? On average. Cost on average. Right. Yeah. Cost on average. That's good. Cost on average about 500, 400, and 250 respectively. While the following year saw only a slight increase in the figures, right? So we know which figures, right? These figures, 500, 400, 250. Perth was the only city where the weekly rent saw no change at all.
Okay.
There's a spelling mistake, right?
Which one? What do you say? Sorry.
Spelling mistake here. Yours, right?
Spelling mistake. There could be a spelling mistake, right? But at this point, I don't really care about spelling mistakes right now. We can fix the mistakes when we're editing the reports.
So I am a little bit obsessed with giving the numbers. So I'm gonna say this sentence. Maybe you can say whether it sounds okay. So I was going to say maybe what the following year saw a negligible rise of about 10 Australian dollars in all of these cities. Something like that.
I like it. I like it. While the following year saw only, then I think we don't need only here, saw a negligible increase
of
maybe of only 10? Or you want to say
10,
about 10? Okay. Maybe, again, approximately 10. Okay, about 10. I don't really care right now. Okay. About 10 Australian. Okay. While the following year saw a negligible increase of about 10 Australian in these cities. You want to say in these cities?
In this, in these cities, in these figures, it doesn't matter.
I think if you're now talking about already like 10 USD, 10 like difference, then you can say this in these cities.
Yeah.
Hold on. While the following year saw a negligible increase of about 10. Maybe, yeah, in these figures is better.
Yeah.
Perth was the only city where the weekly rent saw no change at all.
Perth was, what if we say Perth was the only city where the cost of rent remained unchanged at something?
Sure. Oh, yeah. I was gonna. I had to include the number, but I kind of forgot. Okay, where the cost of rent remained unchanged.
At 300.
At 300. Okay, that's good. That's really good. Okay, yeah. We needed the figure for Perth for sure. Yeah. Okay, now I think it's all better. It's all better. No, yeah. Let's see. If we were to use this introduction, let's say, something like this, and overall, so we can look at the word count. It's about 199. We did it. Like this time, less than 200 words. That's good. But I'm afraid we're gonna need to change a few things. This is what we have Grammarly here. That's what we use for making sure that we have fewer like grammar mistakes. So you can just
Wow.
Overall it's 97. Yeah, overall 97. That's already a very good score, right?
Yeah.
Only a couple of mistakes. Well, not even mistakes, but punctuation. Like usually, I think that's fine using like "and" here without a comma.
This comma is optional in grammar, actually.
It's not even like when you're listing. It's okay not to use the comma. But what's wrong with negligible? Oh, spelling. Thank you. Yeah, that was the negligible. Negligible. Yeah, I put negligible, but I kept saying negligible. So that was the spelling mistake that one of our students pointed out, I think. And that's it. That's 9. It was 97 too, and then it reached 98, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, if we just do what Grammarly says and say use this, and then it's going to go up to 99, I think. Oops, I'm sorry. My bad. So somehow, it's okay. It's okay. What about this one? By contrast, the rise was more noticeable. So why they don't like the word rise?
I don't know.
Let me see. Let me just read this one more time. I'm quite happy with the overall score, though. But it turns out we have 2 worthy sentences. Well, that's clear. And then we could have 2 worthy sentences, yeah. In terms of, like, they don't like the word in terms of specific cities.
So this is like they are telling you to make it shorter, maybe you can say like regarding specific cities.
Regarding specific cities. Okay, let's see. It doesn't like the whole thing now. It was more expensive to rent. Let me just hold on. Overall, the average weekly rent in all cities was generally higher in 2017 for both houses and apartments. Regarding specific cities, it was more expensive to rent accommodation in Sydney and Darwin compared to the other two. Maybe we can say something like it was more expensive to rent. It was more expensive to rent accommodation in Sydney and Darwin compared to the other two. I don't know. I think it's okay to use in terms of specific cities. I don't know. Yeah, no, I'm happy with what we have. Unfortunately, there was not much. The Grammarly, the suggestions, not really suggestions, but at least like highlights by Grammarly this time were not really convincing enough for me to change the whole thing. So I'm kind of happy with what we have. I'm quite happy with the overall score, which kind of, indicates that for grammar, I think we can get a solid 8 here, right? We may not get a good score for task achievements. Maybe we did compare houses and apartments, like with apartments, then we would probably get an 8. But I think for this one, I would give myself or us a band 7 for task achievement. But everything else is band 8. But still, the average, the overall writing score for this one would be 7.5, unfortunately. I realized that we could have, done a better job if we compared houses to apartments. So that could be the homework. See if you can write a different report, everyone. And then this time, maybe your focus should be on like dividing this in terms of cities, like maybe Sydney and Darwin together or Sydney and whatever together, but comparing the average weekly rent for houses as well as like apartments, and then the same thing for the other two cities, if that makes sense, right? So that could be the homework. But overall, I think I'm quite happy with what we have here. Like I said, in the exam, I think it would be able to score 7.5 at least. And I think there was a lot to learn from our work here for this graph. Like I say, even though it looked simple, it wasn't that simple to complete the work, right? To complete the piece of writing. There were some aspects where we really felt frustrated. I think I can move on to the questions section if we have some questions. But if Ildor, if you want to kind of sum it up and maybe kind of give your summary about this, you're more than welcome to do that.
Yeah, I just want to repeat what I said in the beginning. Like usually, like I would say in 8 cases out of 10, it's better to talk about 2 graphs separately. But like we saw today here, sometimes, when you have very clear similarities and very clear differences, you can write across the graphs maybe to increase your score of like task achievement, to show the examiners that you really understand the graph here. So I think that would be the takeaway from this class. Everything else was clear.
I just realized I don't like this sentence. What I don't like is in terms of houses, we're saying in terms of houses, Sydney and Perth, because we can actually ignore this part, right? Let's say we ignore this part because I'm going to highlight this, like ignore the yellow. Now, well, what we have is in terms of houses, Sydney and Perth experienced a marginal rise. We need to say like in weekly rent or in rent or maybe we say in terms of we can say in terms of weekly rent for houses maybe, and then you can say Sydney and Perth were the average. Now we have to change this. Where the average, where the figures. We need to change. I don't know. I just didn't like it because when you somehow ignore this part because it's separated by 2 commas, which you should do because it's a non-defining relative clause, then if you don't talk about the rent, so outside the comma, it just doesn't make sense. Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So in terms of weekly rent for houses, Sydney and Perth, where the average weekly rent was the highest and lowest respectively, experienced a marginal rise. Maybe something like, we can say in terms of houses, Sydney and Perth, where the average weekly rent was the highest and lowest, respectively experienced a marginal rise.
Marginal rise with the average weekly rent. Is it correct or not?
In cost of rent, maybe. We might have to repeat ourselves, but that just makes more sense. Rise in cost of weekly rent.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So yeah, it's okay. I understand. I tend to be a bit mechanical sometimes. So yeah.
No, I don't like to repeat myself in the same sentence, but since we decided to went for this structure, this is the downside of this structure, right? Like where we have this non-identifying clause, and then you have to drop this non-identifying clause when you're reading, and it should still make sense. Like in terms of houses, Sydney and Perth experienced a marginal rise. Doesn't really make sense to me.
Yeah.
Doesn't sound good to me, you know?
Yeah. I get it. Yes. Yeah, we could actually even remove this part because when I gave this like suggestion, I was thinking like in terms of like in the previous one we did not use this.
Yeah. I understand, but how can we change it now? Like, what is the best way to change it? Like, we still need to say it's the highest and lowest. I think now we can put this like highest and lowest should be the focus of the sentence rather than like the additional point, right? In terms of houses.
Okay, so we are already talking about rent. What if we don't use like non-relative clause, or we just say this Sydney and Perth, the most and the least expensive cities, because we said in terms of houses, yes, in the beginning. So we can now say expensive without it meaning other things. Yeah. So
in terms of houses, Sydney and Perth. What are we changing here?
We're just removing the sentence. We're just saying the most and the least expensive cities.
Okay, let me just start over here.
We can even use not to commas or just to like, what are they called? Hyphens?
But it would still be the same thing. But hold on, I'm trying to change the place. Like I wanted to move this highest and lowest to the main part of the sentence, main clause, and add this experiencing a marginal rise to the this non-defining part clause.
No,
that makes sense.
That wouldn't work because the next sentence focuses on the change.
No, it doesn't. That's the whole point. The next sentence actually focuses on the highest and lowest. While the figure for Sydney hovered around 500, like it was 500, Perth it was 300. So we're actually focusing on 500 and 300, which is the highest and lowest. We're not actually talking about change at all. Because there was no change, like almost no change. Make sense? Let's see if that works. If that works, it works. If it doesn't, then we'll just, that's why I'm not really deleting the whole sentence, but I want to start over and see if it works. So I don't even like in terms of houses now, like maybe something like in terms of weekly rent for a house in Sydney, in Perth. Maybe, and then you can say both of which experienced a marginal, only a marginal rise. Okay. The average, we can just start with the average weekly rent for a house in Sydney and Perth, both of which experienced only a marginal rise, were the highest and lowest, respectively. Something like that. The average weekly rent for a house in Sydney and Perth, both of which experienced only a marginal rise, were the highest and lowest, respectively. And then we can say, while the figure for Sydney hovered around 500 USD, the weekly rent for a house in Perth cost about 300. So now we're talking about 500 to 300, like highest and lowest, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I like when, look, in the original sentence, you added this cost of weekly rent, right? Because you so I like that part because, stylistically speaking, like grammatically everything is okay here, but stylistically speaking, the main clause should be at least like in length, at least equal to the dependent clause. Yeah. Yeah, and then I am feeling like in the new sentence here, it's again like the non-identifying part is like slightly kind of longer. Yeah, but that is probably I'm like.
Yeah, no, you're right. You're right. So which one do you like better? Like the second one? You mean in this case, like the original sentence, you like it better? Like.
Yeah, right now I like the original sentence better just because the main part is longer. Yeah. So.
Then maybe can we say where the average figure was in terms of houses? I just want to get rid of weekly rent here.
Yeah.
Can we get rid of weekly rent here?
Okay. Well, just saying average, I guess that makes sense.
Where the average was the highest and lowest, I don't know. In terms of houses, the average houses, Sydney and Perth, experienced the marginal rise in cost of weekly rent. The average weekly rent for a house in Sydney and Perth, both of which experienced only a marginal rise, were the highest and lowest respectively. Okay, I think we need to make a decision. We ran for a house.
It doesn't matter. Like this one, choosing the whichever one, I think wouldn't change the score anyway. So.
Okay, all right. So then I'm just gonna stick with the next one because I just don't like repeating the same phrase in one sentence. Okay, so that's our new model answer. Just to make sure that I change this to.
You have, I think you have an article problem there.
This Grammarly doesn't like both of for some reason, both of which, and we have this. The average weekly rent for a house in Sydney and Perth, both of which is a marginal rise, only a marginal. Yeah. I'm missing only a marginal rise, with the highest and lowest respectively. Okay, I give up. The score went down actually, but it just didn't make sense. It didn't make sense to me without this weekly rent thing.
I think I have an idea of why Grammarly doesn't like both of which. Maybe it thinks that which both is the right grammar. Maybe.
Nah, I don't think so. You think?
Yeah. No.
No.
Okay.
No, that's the same thing. All right.
Try both of whom.
No, it's underlying both of. Now it's underlying the whole phrase. So it doesn't just maybe just get rid of both of them, which experienced only marginal later. But we need both because it's indicating two cities. So now the Grammarly, I don't care what it says, but I think both of which is absolutely correct. Yeah, I think we're done with the model answer. Let's move on to questions. If we have any questions in the chat, or if you guys want to jump on the mic and but I saw some question here, maybe not really relevant to this model answer, but Mr. Instructor said, can you share the recorded video of all classes we had so far? I think I have been sharing every single class, but we're only sharing materials in a very specific private channel that we created for you guys because everyone was complaining about, losing those videos. Because of all the chat here in the groups. So that's why we decided to create a new channel. We provided the link a number of times, so you can go to the channel and you can enjoy all the recorded lessons there. You can add shown or in question. Okay, all right, yeah. There's a group. It's not a group, it's a channel, but yeah, that's what they mean. Ask them to add you. Links in the group can be shared or forwarded. Okay. And now we have some overview and the introduction maybe. Grammarly Grammarly people. Grammarly people. Shundoq Grammarly saytiga borasizlarda Grammarly saytiga borasizlarda o'sha appgrammarly.com ga o'sha post qilsangiz o'zi chiqarib beraveradi. Mana Go Premium turibdi. Bu degani sotib olib bizga taklif qilyapti mana xatolarni konkret ko'rish uchun. Atak sotib olmasa ham bo'laveradi. Shart emas. Yana nima bizdaligi bor? Sherzod says, if we say in all cities, isn't it general? Grammatikada shunaqa qoida bor, the article shunaqa qoidasi, all so'zi bilan the article tushirib qo'ysa ham bo'laveradi. Ya'ni misol uchun in all the cities desangiz ham bo'ladi. lekin all cities singular, ya'ni o'sha the artikelni qo'ysa qo'ymasa uchun ma'no o'zgarmaydi. Endi biz bitta o'sha specific o'sha citylar aytganimiz baribir aniq bo'lib turgani uchun shart emas. Menimcha shart emas. Endi bitta Eldor, siz nima deb o'ylaysiz?
I think it's okay.
In all the cities, like
yeah, o'sha farqi yo'q menimcha. Plus biz introductionda ham baribir o'sha 4 ta aniq shaharligini aytib ketdik, shuning uchun.
Men o'shani qoidasini topib tashlab yuborishga harakat qilaman. O'sha alldan keyin shart emasligini qoidasini topsam, o'zim ham o'qib o'sha narsaga ishonchim komil bo'lsa, screenshot tashlab yuborishga harakat qilaman. Yes, I think we should clarify because the graph is only comparing 4 Australian cities, not all the cities, but they've written in all cities. That's what I'm asking. Yeah, o'sha gap ekan, o'sha gap ekan. Tем более bitta artikel qolib ketdi. Agar mabodo xato qilgan taqdirimizda ham bu big deal bo'lmasdi. Bu artikel xato hisoblanadi. Haligi bunaqa hamma dunyoni hamma shahrini nazarda tutibdi deb o'ylamaydi hech kim buni o'qib turib. Prosta artikel tushib qolibdi deydi. Bu artikel tushib qolishi bizga o'zi non nativelarga xos narsa. Shuning uchun bu boshqa joylarda yo ortiqcha artikel bor yoki tushib qolgan baribir shu qatorida ketaveradi. It's not a big deal. Buni katta ball tushmaydi bunga. Is it okay to use a complex sentence in the introduction and overview? Depends on how good your English is. Agar ingliz tilingizga ishonsangiz, mayli ishlatavering. Complex sentence degan просто wildly gapirib qo'ysa ham complex sentence. Endi overviewda ishlatsa bo'laveradi agar ingliz tili yaxshi bo'lsa. Ingliz tili yaxshi bo'lmasa, unda simple sentence ga stick qilgan yaxshi. Let's see. Any other questions? Hop, bo'lmasam shu yerda biz recordingni tugatsam bo'laveradi menimcha. Qolganlar darsda qatnashmaganlar bu savollar uchun qiziq bo'lmasligi mumkin.